It's good to be back with you again for week 3 of Sweeter Than Chocolate Hebrews 11. I hope you've had a good week of study and that you've let the material flex to meet you right where you're at. Instead of starting off with a review, we're going to jump right into the text because much of our time today is going to be spent filling in the details of the story where Hebrews 11 has only given us passing references. So let me read the text from Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 22, and let's get to it. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendants shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. In this section of text, we see the movement of God in growing his people. He's promised Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens and as numerous as the sand by the seashore. And Abraham takes God at his word. In 5 verses here, we have a summary of God's people moving from one man to a family, to a small clan, and finally to an enormous people group. And it all goes back to what we call the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham that he will give him a land and a seed. And the text tells us that Abraham believed God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Now stick with me here. When Paul recounts the story in Romans 4, the term that he uses for reckoned or credited is legizomai. It's an accounting term. It means to credit to one's account. It's very interesting that the author of Hebrews takes that very significant term and turns it around in our text here. Abraham, when asked to sacrifice Isaac, considers, it's logizomai, he considers God faithful. Abraham could bank on God. He is, after all, a God whose power and reach extend beyond death. Enoch never died. We've already seen that. Abraham understood that God's power does not stop at the grave. And he finally understood that the promise that was coming through this one particular child. And that's when we run into the story that always made this only begotten daughter sleep with one eye opened. It's the account of the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, the Genesis account gives us kind of the stark obedience. Remember last week we talked about Abraham and Sarah not looking back to where they came from. Well, now, from a human perspective, this would have been the perfect time to look back and get out of Dodge. But Abraham didn't. His heart was set toward obedience. And based on the Genesis account alone, we might be tempted to just think this dude is crazy for not just running fast the other way. But Hebrews clears the matter up for us. Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed God would bring him back to life. Here. Now, Abraham, at this time, had a history with God. By now, he knew that God couldn't lie. He knew that God was trustworthy, and he knew that the promise had to come through this particular kid. So, if God wanted the sacrifice, God was obligated, in a sense, to bring him back to life. And we read, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Abraham did not offer Isaac in a blind faith to a capricious God. He offered him to a loving God with whom he had a long history. Think about it. Abraham was called at 75 years old. Isaac was born when he was 100. And at this point, Isaac's old enough to carry the wood for the sacrifice, and almost certainly he could have taken Abraham out if he'd wanted to. So do the math. We're talking God and Abraham probably go back a good 35 years at this point, maybe 40. What we do know, by this time Abraham knew the specific word of God. The promise would come to him, not only through his body, not only through Sarah, the promise was coming through this kid, through Isaac. And because Abraham knew the character of God, he knew the reality was that God would have to raise Isaac. I can't tell you how relieved I was the first time I read Hebrews 11 and saw this. It just made so much more sense. I love that God didn't ask him to follow in this kind of obedience as a young man. He asked him as a man who had history and relationship with him. Abraham knew that even if death entered the story, death wouldn't be the end. And isn't that just the way with God? Remember, Jesus says God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And so Abraham the man is willing to sacrifice his one and only son, a picture of what God himself will do years later on the same mountain as Jesus dies for the sins of the world. And over the next verses, we see the scope shift from one man, like I said, to a family, to a small clan, and eventually to an enormous people group that will become a nation. So let's do a quick rewind here and talk through what we have so far. God, of course, is before everything. The book of Genesis opens with creation, which reminds us of Adam and Eve and their children, Cain and Abel. Enoch is a big character who falls in after creation, but before Noah. And the two big events to remember early on are creation and the flood during the time of Noah. Here we have a big, distinguishable time period. Everything changed after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, and everything changes again at the flood. There's a new beginning of sorts, but it will not bring the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution to sin is still to come in Jesus Christ. After Noah, the next major character is Abraham. He and his wife Sarah, after many, many years of waiting on the promise of God, finally have a son named Isaac. Hebrews runs very quickly over Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, so I'm going to fill you in a little more here in case you're not familiar with the story. As Isaac grows up, his already elderly parents continue to age, and eventually Sarah dies. It's at this point that Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. He sends the servant back to the relatives in Paddan Aram, which is essentially over the river and through the woods up to the northeast. The servant brings back Rebekah, the sister of Laban, and she's going to be a wife for Isaac. Like his parents before him, though, Isaac and his wife have fertility problems. They marry when Isaac's 40 years old, and they don't have children until he's 60. Apparently, though, Isaac learned something from his own scrambled family. Instead of trying to figure things out on his own, the text tells us that Isaac prayed for his wife and she conceived twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the firstborn, but Jacob is born grabbing onto his brother's heel and ends up with the leading role. Esau, the hairy, tough, hunting, manly man, seems to be more brawn than brains, and his smooth little brother Jacob is more than happy to take advantage of that. The family smacks of dysfunction. Dad Isaac prefers Esau, while Mom Rebekah loves Jacob. Eventually, Esau loses both the family birthright and the blessing to Jacob. He forfeits the birthright when he trades it to Jacob in exchange for a bowl of stew. And he loses the blessing when Rebekah and Jacob team up to deceive an aged and blind Isaac. Esau becomes the father of the nation of Edom. They're a people group that live on the other side of the Dead Sea. Now, after the stolen blessing incident, Jacob is sent up to Uncle Laban in Paddan Aram. Again, over the river and through the woods, up to the northeast. That's where Mama's from. Mama's afraid that Esau is going to kill Jacob, so she wants him out of town fast. When Jacob finally arrives there, he meets his cousin Rachel and falls head over heels in love with her. Now, I know that sounds weird to us, with it being a cousin and all, but it was okay back then. He agrees to work for his uncle Laban for 7 years so he can marry Rachel. At the end of the time, though, perhaps with the lights low, Uncle Laban performs the bait and switch. And Jacob wakes up the day after the wedding in bed next to Rachel's older sister Leah. The trickster has been tricked. The younger son, who had deceived his own older brother, has been tricked into marrying Rachel's older sister. Ouch. Laban does give Rachel to Jacob also, after he completes his marriage week with Leah. But he gets her on the condition that he'll work another 7 years. Leah is a cash deal. Rachel is credit. In another deja vu instance, we see Rachel barren, just like Rebecca and Sarah before her. But God opens the womb of unloved Leah. Now, eventually, both Rachel and Leah give their handmaidens to Jacob. So from Jacob and these 4 women are born the 12 tribes of Israel. And you might be thinking, wouldn't that be the 12 tribes of Jacob? Well, yes, except that along the way, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. So the Israelites go back to Jacob. Abraham is not an Israelite. Abraham is referred to as a Hebrew. The nation of Israel begins with Jacob, whose name is Israel. And that, my friend, is where we're going to stop today. So here are the names we want to remember up to this point. Everything starts with God. And we have Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for the sake of remembering, I always like to run those 3 together like one long word. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. If you think you're not getting it, don't worry, you will. Next week, we're going to Egypt. But before we close our time today, here are a couple of questions to discuss. We know that Abraham clearly considered the character of God as he lived by faith. How can knowing God's character help you live by faith this week? What attribute of God do you most need to consider? Then think about this. Is there anything in your life that you hold more dear than God? I want you to think about how you spend your time and your money and your energy as you answer. Have you ever considered how you spend your various resources really do indicate what you hold dear? Something to think about. And before you wrap up, go ahead and post your biggest takeaway application from the life of Abraham. What have you learned from his life of faith that's changing the way you think and act this week? I love that God can be trusted. Even with Isaac. He can be trusted to carry out his purpose in this world. Nothing can stop his plan, not even death. Abraham got that. The purpose of God is bigger than just what we see here. There is a city to come. This week, like Abraham, let's live like strangers who are looking for that city.